This presentation by Dr. Lisa Baxter from University of Georgia is part of the Spring 2021 Beef Cattle Production Series organized by Fort Valley State University, Dr. Nikki Whitley and Stefan Price with AgriUnity, Mr. Handy Kennedy.
All right. So thank you all for joining us. We get a lot of questions, especially this time of year, on people making their fertilizer plans. It may either be on winter annuals that you have growing now, or if we're kind of gearing up for our summer hay season. So we're going to talk on some of the bigger picture topics within soil fertility. But if you have more specific questions at any time, do not hesitate to let me know. So when we start thinking about our forage yield, we tend to use this barrel scenario for a lot of different forage processes. And it goes to show that our forage is only as productive as whatever our most limiting nutrient is. So we often think that that's nitrogen, but in many cases, it's actually potassium or our soil pH. And so even though we're fertilizing with this much nitrogen, we may only have enough potassium out there to yield this much. So when we start looking at our fertilizing strategies, we talk a lot about a balanced fertilizer plan and the importance of pH and so on, because even though we tend to focus on nitrogen in practice, it's a lot of these other nutrients that are really limiting our yield productivity. So if none of you have ever met Dr. Jennifer Tucker here on the Tipton campus, she's well known for saying, unless you test, it's just a guess. So many of the times we just want to follow kind of a blanket recommendation for our farm. But we really have to know the status of each field to optimize its productivity. So when we're going out to take a soil sample, this is kind of the quick checklist of stuff that we need to go out with. Some sort of soil probe in a clean plastic bucket. I use this collect and go system. You can kind of see the spiralized probe on the end of the drill there. I collect a lot of samples in a very short period for my research. So this is the one that I bought. There's a lot of different soil probes out there, from drill types to push type probes. There's not one that necessarily works better than another. It's just what you have available and or how much you're interested in spending. Nearly every county office that I've ever interacted with has some sort of soil test kit available. They'll either lend you or come out and pull the samples for you. So there's a lot spread around our state. We want to make sure that we have our UGA or some other soil test bag, usually a flathead screwdriver if we're using more of a push type probe to scrape the sample out, and then something to crush the cores or mix samples, usually a scrap of wood, because especially if we're in more of a clay type soil, those cores can really hang together. Now you'll notice up here that I have the word plastic underlined, and that's for a really good reason. It's important that it doesn't matter what shape, size, color, whatever bucket you want, as long as it's clean and plastic. If we use a metal bucket, it can actually contribute some of the or interfere with some of the micronutrients in the soil sample, and it makes it look like we have some toxicities in the micronutrients that we wouldn't have had we collected the sample with a plastic bucket. So it's something that happens several times a year for samples that are sent to me. So it's something just to be cautious of. When we're going out to take the soil sample, a sample actually is 15 to 20 cores that are selected from just random locations around the field. Our cores should only be about 4 inches deep, except for alfalfa, and we'll do 2 different cores for that particular crop because of its root system. One sample is only going to represent 5 to 15 what we call similar acres, and that'll make more sense on the next slide. But it's similar in terms of soil type, our slope, drainage, how we've managed it, etc. We want to mix those cores thoroughly and fill the bag up until, so from the UGA bag, it's about 2/3 up the distance of the bag. I'll go ahead and tell you 15 to 20 cores ends up with a lot more soil than the fill to this line. point on the bag. So you're going to collect more than what you actually need to fill that bag. That's so that we can really mix it well and get a good thorough sample. So when we go out to take our forage samples, it's really tempting to just step inside the gate and pull a few cores, but we really got to get out and walk that field, get as random as we can so that we're representing all the variability in that field. We've got to be cautious of our gateways, tree lines, feeding areas, roadways, any shade point, because those are areas where nutrients are going to or tend to accumulate. It can give us some false readings on our soil test. So our soil test is only going to be as good and as representative as our sampling procedure. And so this is probably one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make, is just taking a few cores right near the gateway. So when someone asks me, how many samples do I need? It really does depend. Most people are going to have at least 3. One for pastures, one to represent a hay field, and one to represent an annual field. But we even have to represent some areas within that. So a lot of our pastures are going to have slopes and flat ground areas and depressions that are all going to need different samples depending on the variation between those. And so my answer is you take as many samples as you need to ensure that adequate representation across the farm. So when we get the question of how often we pull soil samples, we want to test our hay fields every year, and our pastures usually every 3 years. Most producers will set up a rotation on their farm after they get started, so they sample a third of their pastures every year rather than the entire farm every 3rd year. The reason for the difference there is because when we look at our big 3, our nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, if we look at how much a 6-ton yielding hayfield would pull out in a year, it's 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I think it came out to about 85 pounds of the phosphate and 250 pounds or so of the potash or potassium. When we compare that to what a 500-pound grazing animal would have pulled out of that soil, it's negligible compared to what that hayfield is pulling, or that hay production is pulling out. And so that's why we can get by with testing the pastures less often than we do our hayfields. So the best time of year to pull a sample, and this question comes up every month out of the year, in my opinion, it's never a bad time to pull a soil sample. What is more important for you on your farm is to be consistent, because numbers typically are lower in the fall than in the spring. We've just came out of a high production season in many cases, and the numbers are going to naturally be a little lower. So whatever time of year works for you, fall versus spring, that's a good time in my opinion. We do occasionally get questions on, is grid sampling worth the time or money? So if any of you are working with a consultant, there are some that will really push you into more of a grid sampling rather than the zone sampling that we tend to recommend. If we're new to our farm and we're not familiar with where those low spots are and so on, or maybe our lower yielding areas, grid sampling can help you initially define those zones. So this was a field down at the Sunbelt Ag Expo. I think this particular picture was for potassium or something like that. And you can see that there was a corner of that field that had very high potassium readings. This upper part of the field was very low, and then kind of intermediate there in the middle. So if we had walked into this field and never had farmed it before in our life, grid sampling would really help us be able to point out that we didn't need to apply on this acre or so, and we needed to apply more in this other corner of the field to help equalize that yield in the field. So it can be a useful tool. We don't have a great recommendation for the scale of the grid. It really just depends on your operation and the layout of the land and the variability that we're expecting within that. So it is something to consider to help us better define those zones and move towards that zone style soil sampling and management. So when we go to submit our sample, you would be surprised the number of producers that stop at that step. So it's great that we've submitted the sample, but we have to actually follow what all is on that soil test recommendation to optimize the yield. This is an example from our UGA lab, and the numbers here, to be able to read this isn't important. What I want you to draw your attention to is the bottom of our report, and many other reports from private labs will do something similar. They list out exactly what needs to be applied for that field based on how you filled out the sample or the sample form when you submitted it to the lab. So if you've changed your mind about what you wanted to plant, or you found out you had Bahia grass instead of bermuda grass or something like that, we can find new recommendations online using our crop code sheet through the UGA website or the Feed Environmental Water Lab website to get a new recommendation without having to submit another sample. And your county agent can help you through that if you need. So this can link to a lot of different questions. It's usually what fertilizer should I use? When do I put it out? Start getting to questions about lime. And so we're going to walk through each of these. When we look at the different types of fertilizer, there's even a lot of questions within there. So it's usually how much do I need of whatever nutrient. We're going to look at if you need any other nutrients, if we're trying to change the pH at the same time. And sometimes it's a more practical question of, do you have the right equipment in your area to handle the type of fertilizer, and just what is available locally. There's a lot of different fertilizers I would love to try. They're just not available in my area. And sometimes that's the practical limitation. So these are kind of some book values for typical fertilizer options that you may find in the Southeast and Eastern U.S. Ammonium nitrate was kind of our old standard. It was about 34% nitrogen. It's a great option. It can be hard to find, though, because of its use in terror activities in the past. So that's kind of our gold standard. It's just really hard to find. Ammonium sulfate is also an option. You can see it's got less nitrogen in it, though. It tends to be used in cases of where we need to pull down that pH. So something like blueberries, for instance, that needs a really acidic pH or acidic soil. That's why you see so much ammonium sulfate used there. You may have ran across UAN. It's a very popular option, especially in South Georgia. It's got a range of nitrogen. It is a liquid nitrogen solution that's going to contain urea and ammonium nitrate. Urea is another popular option, usually because of that higher nitrogen content that it has. The problem with urea is it's very prone to substantial losses because of volatilization, and we'll get into that later in the presentation. Adding that sulfur coating brings down the percent nitrogen, but does make it more stable. But where it is a sulfur product, it's going to be more acidic and pulling down that pH. There's a lot of broiler litter and cattle manure used in our state. The problem with both of these is they're highly variable. Usually broiler litter, only about half of the nitrogen's available instantly. And you can see that, it's only about 3% nitrogen. So we've got to put out a lot of material to equal the nitrogen level that we need. Cattle manure, most of it's based off of feedlot data. And so our actual barn manure is going to be much lower in nitrogen than even that 1.5 level that's presented here. And then the last one I do get questions on is anhydrous ammonia. We don't recommend it in our state just because it has to be pressurized and then turn into a gas. Oops, there we go. The process is very dangerous, and majority of our producers across our state and region are just not set up to handle this product. So it's not one that we're going to recommend. Whenever we're choosing the nitrogen source, we want to consider that percentage of nitrogen and use whatever nitrogen percentage that we can to get it in there. I'm not sure why broiler litter came out so high in this particular example. So even though like the ammonium nitrate, the anhydrous ammonia is at 82% nitrogen, the problem with that is, we're not going to recommend that one because it's so hard to handle. This one's usually not all the way or not readily available in the soil. So most of us are going to use a urea ammonium nitrate or a urea ammonium nitrate combination. So whenever I mentioned, we do have the safety concerns there, but we've got to think about how we're going to put out these products. With our solids, they tend to be easier for a lot of us to put out. The liquid product can be difficult. Can be difficult to put out through some sprayers. I think they've worked on it in recent years to make it flow better through a lot of sprayers. A lot of us, especially up in the northern part of the state, really want to use some of the solid fertilizers. They just don't have a good fertilizer spreader or through their co-op for a smaller pasture type area. So each one of us are going to have different challenges depending on where we are in the state. So there's not one that's necessarily the best nitrogen source, but it is, something we need to be aware of all of our options. And then when we do go to pick, choose the one that's going to work best for us in terms of handling ability. And then has the cheapest price per nutrient. So when we look at our phosphorus fertilizer options, there's a much shorter list here. Most of us, if we can get a hold of it, are going to really try to use those top three, especially in a commercial hay type operation. You may have seen diammonium phosphate, monoammonium phosphate. It's usually abbreviated as DAP or MAP. These two do have nitrogen mixed in with it at just a lower rate if needed, whereas the triple superphosphate is straight phosphorus. Because these first two have nitrogen mixed in, they do have an effect on lowering that soil pH. Again, there's a lot of broiler litter and cattle manure used throughout our state. It's fairly low in phosphorus, but what usually happens is you'll notice that these numbers are essentially the same as what was on the previous slide. So that puts it at a 1-to-1 ratio with the nitrogen to phosphorus, but plants actually need it at more of a 4-to-1 ratio. So they need about 4 to 5 times more nitrogen than they do phosphorus, even in our hay fields. And so the problem with applying strictly our fertilizer as broiler litter or cattle manure is we drastically over apply the phosphorus, and we'll get into it in a few slides as to why that can be problematic. Majority of us, if we're not using a broiler litter or cattle manure, are going to use a muriate of potash. So it's 60% potassium in there. Doesn't have an effect on our soil pH. We have the same problems there with the broiler litter and cattle manure. Your fertilizer co-op may call it muriate of potash. They may just call it potash. Most of us will anyway. That's by far our cheapest, most available option. If you're also farming row crops, you may have seen some liquid potassium options for things like cotton and so on. We don't recommend those in forages because of the volume that they have to be applied versus the economics of our product that we're getting off of that land area. It just doesn't pencil out for us. So when we're looking at kind of the cost benefit of a particular fertilizer, we've got to look at the units of a nutrient versus pounds of a fertilizer and correct for that difference in the concentration. So when we're trying to figure out how many pounds of fertilizer we need, we're going to divide whatever pounds of nutrients by the concentration. So if we need 50 or 100 pounds of nitrogen, and we're going to apply as urea that's 46% nitrogen, then we're going to take 100 pounds of nitrogen divided by 0.46 of the urea, and that'll give us how many pounds of urea that we need to put out. If we're going to fertilize, or if our fertilizer supplies more than one nutrient, we're going to apply it based on whichever one has the greatest percentage. So if we're using something like that diammonium phosphate, then we need to apply based on our phosphorus recommendation and then fill that nitrogen gap with one of those other nitrogen fertilizers. Because doing it the other way means we over apply in phosphorus, which can have some poor ecological benefit or negative effects. So then, especially as we get into the mountains of Piedmont, a lot of us have clovers out there. And so if the legume represents less than 15% of the stand, then we're going to fertilize and maintain that as a grass stand, because the legumes aren't contributing enough nitrogen to truly benefit the grass. Our nitrogen generally isn't required if our legume is exceeding 30 to 40% of the stand. And so we can, visually estimate that or go out and do some point quadrats or something like that to get a better feel for it. Many producers overestimate how much nitrogen or how much clover they have out in their field. So take that into account. We tend to focus on the flowers on the clover, and it makes it look like there's a lot more there than what there actually is. So if we want to see if our legume is working, because just because there's a clover there, it doesn't mean that it's doing its job and fixing nitrogen. There's no way above ground to know this. We grab a shovel, dig very carefully, especially if you're in more of a clay type soil. We're either going to, once we kind of pull up where a plant is, we'll either gently brush if we're in a sandier soil, or if we're in a more clay type, we'll need to rinse it off with water to get the soil away from the roots. And then you should see little nodules on the roots, and we're going to pinch those open to see what color is inside. If it's a pink or red color, that means that nitrogen fixation is occurring, whereas white means nothing's happening. So these were two examples that I found in my old pictures. Pull this back. This was a lupin. I don't know why it's moving forward there. This was a lupin sample from last year, and you can see that it had huge white nodules on that main taproot, very bright red in the middle. Most of us are going to deal with ones more this size. This was a little hairy vetch nodule out in West Texas. Again, you've got kind of that white there on the outside that's pretty typical, but you want to look for that red or pink there on the inside, and that means nitrogen fixation is occurring. So when we go to put the fertilizer out, we really have to consider when the forage is going to use these nutrients. If we're looking at applying to Bermuda grass, ideally we're going to apply after green up and at each harvest after that, except for the last. If we go out and apply our nitrogen in one big application, we'll get really great yields at the beginning of the season, but it's really going to taper off after that to virtually no yield by the end. We put it out twice, we'll start kind of equal or distributing that yield across the season. But if we could put it out 4 or more times, depending on our number of harvests and where we're at, we're going to get better yield distribution across the season and better nitrogen uptake by that Bermuda grass. This was some work from one of our previous UGA researchers, and it found that if we're applying nitrogen above a critical level, so whatever level is needed just to keep that plant alive would be our critical level. Our coastal or Tipton 85 Bermuda grass, you can see that it uses nitrogen differently throughout the season, and that's why distributing it helps equalize that yield. So it's really we're gonna see the most bang for our buck there in the peak summer season, which makes sense because Bermuda grass was bred to be very productive during the summer. Whereas something like annual ryegrass kind of contrasts that. We plant very early with our ryegrass in many cases, but we don't really use it until late in the season. And so even though we need to apply nitrogen early to get it started, we're going to see a better yield benefit by applying it later in the season whenever the animals are actually using it or we're actually harvesting that ryegrass. If we're looking at tall fescue, I don't know if any of you are up in tall fescue country. Remember that tall fescue managed as hay is going to require more than pastures, but overall, fescue requires much less fertilizer than Bermuda grass does. So if we're looking at 2 cuttings of hay, we're going to apply 60 to 75 pounds of nitrogen, usually late February and September. We recommend 3 cuttings of hay, so that would be adding an application in May following that first harvest. Pastures, you can see that number greatly decreases and is dependent on our number of animals per acre. A lot of times we don't have fields dedicated to just one thing. So it's not uncommon to have pasture lands that we do cut for hay at least once per year. So then we would put out about 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre in early fall and the rest in early spring. When we go to put out our phosphorus, there's not really a better time to put it out. We tend to recommend late summer or fall, especially if it's on an established crop, just because our fertilizer prices tend to be a little cheaper during these times because it's an off-peak time of year when we're comparing it to row crop production. The demand for the product tends to be low, and the demand for the spreading surface tends to be low. For most of us, unless we have a hurricane coming through, it's going to be less risk of phosphorus runoff during this time as well. When we look at our potassium applications, and so this is much more important in Bermuda grass, although potassium is still important in fescue. We want to apply 40 to 50% in late spring and 50 to 60% in mid to late season. So we're usually at green up, so May or so, and then again late August, early September for our mid-late season application. So if we are trying to cut corners and say, well, I'm just going to spend all my money on nitrogen this year, we'll worry about potassium in a couple years. Look here at this graph. So it measures or compares the stand density rating and the rhizome production pounds per acre across those different potassium applications. So those dark bars represent the stand density rating, and that the black line there is the increased rhizome production. So it's no surprise that the more rhizomes we have out there, the denser the stand, and it's increasing with our potassium, increased potassium applications each year. So to kind of compare this, and we just recently made a quick video on this on our Georgia Forages website too. We have if we put out 200 pounds for 3 to 4 years, we're looking at about $200 to $300 an acre. By comparison, if the stand thins down and we have to go in and resprig in 4 years or so, that's going to cost at minimum $400 per acre, and we're losing about 6 to 12 months in productivity from that field. So in a time where we are trying to cut costs, this is one cost that I wouldn't cut. So the problem with the lower fertility, let's say we skipped a potassium application in lime for a season, but reality has probably been 2 or 3 or more. Our grass is going to start to thin out. We have those undesirable species like broom sedge starting to move in. Our annual crops aren't going to establish as well, and it just catapults into lower yields in future seasons. Now, when we're talking about pasture fertilization, it's important to remember that pastures don't require as much fertilizer, but the nutrients are often poorly distributed across the field. And so these may be a little hard to see, especially if you're viewing on a phone. Put these up there. So we start kind of down here at our point 0, and it's the distance from the water in each direction. If we just had 3 paddocks on the farm, so they're rotating, let's say once a month or so, this is a pretty big field. We got 400 feet this way and 900 feet another way. The darker the colors is the higher concentration of manure in that field. So you can see there's a lot of very light areas in here. Whereas if they tightened up that rotation and it has, 100 to 400 down here feet from the water source, you see a lot more dark gray. To look at it in a different way for another study, we want to think about rotational grazing as a fertilization tool. And so in this study, they put in a temporary fence here in the middle of the field. to restrict the animals to one side and then the other. And the more spots that you see on there, either manure or fecal spots that was measured out there in that field. So to tie that all together, our manure distribution in the grazing systems is going to increase with our increasing frequency. So if we had a continuous grazing system, so we never move the animals on our farm, it's going to take 27 years to get one manure pile for every square yard, or about 3 square feet. If we tighten that down to a 14-day rotation, so we move twice a month, then it would take 8 years. 4-day rotation for 5 years, and if we moved every other day, it would only take 2 years. So to summarize that a step further, our smaller paddocks and a more frequent rotation is going to give us that better nutrient distribution and really helps kind of combat any potential deficiencies that we have or could have in our pasture system. So if there's nothing else that you take away from this, or if there's one thing that you could do to your pastures and hayfields this season, it's going to be put out lime to maintain that soil pH. The soil pH affects a lot of soil properties, and the one we tend to focus on is nutrient availability. But when we get to the extremes in terms of very acidic or very basic, it starts affecting the structure of the soil. The soil can literally turn to mush if we go too high. It can limit our soil biological activity, and very low pHs that we often deal with in Georgia, we start running into aluminum toxicity. We tend to talk about this more in legumes, although it can happen in grasses, because our legumes, whether we're talking about alfalfa or some of our clovers and Lespedizas here, do need a much higher pH to survive than our grasses. The grasses can handle those high 5 pretty well, even though they would perform better if the pH was over 6. But some crops, especially something like alfalfa with a taproot, when it starts reaching down into the 5.5 region, it'll die pretty instantly because the aluminum starts becoming more available. So this graph can be kind of hard to see, so I'll read it out here. If we're just going to focus first on these top 3, so it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The wider that black bar is on there, the more available a nutrient is. So right in the middle of the picture at 6.5, you can see that the NP and K are the most available. And as we move more acidic, because we tend not to go more basic in Georgia, we tend to go more acidic. They're becoming less and less available. As our good nutrients are becoming less available, things like manganese, zinc, iron, and aluminum down here on the bottom are becoming more available. And that's why when we dip below that 5.5 and start getting into the availability of these micronutrients, we can start running into toxicities pretty quickly. So if we want to look at, it can be hard to visualize what the difference there is between that 6 and 6.5 or whatever numbers you want to use. But just doing the math between a 5.6 and a 6.2, if we put out that 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 50 pounds of the phosphorus, and 150 pounds of the potassium, just that decrease in nutrient efficiency and uptake leads to a loss of $62 per acre using the unit prices that we have here. So it's going to vary by location and by year. Whenever we do this presentation and actually in person, I like to ask everybody how much they've paid for lime recently. And I've had some high numbers come up before. Some have been in the $40 range, but nobody's ever given me a number bigger than 62. So if you can do nothing else, this is what you need to put out on your fields this year in most cases. So there's a couple different lime products out there. Ag limestone is the most common. We're starting to see other products show up. Wood ash, marl, some slag, eggshells, etc. Had a lot of calls recently about paper mill type products. There's not a lot of work that has been done on this, and so we're still going to recommend ag limestone in most cases. There are 2 main kinds out there, the dolomitic lime and the calcitic or high cal lime. If you also need magnesium, we'll go towards the dolomitic lime. The high cal lime tends to neutralize faster because it is a smaller size. Generally, if someone just says they have ag lime, it's probably going to be the dolomitic limestone. But your fertilizer co-op should know which lime source that they have. So just like with soil testing, if someone asks, when should I apply lime? In my opinion, there's never a bad time to put lime out. It's always a great day to put some lime out on those fields. We want to consider applying during off times if we're trying to save money. The more important thing here to remember is that it can take 6 to 12 months at least, depending on where we are in the state, to see a substantial change in pH. So it's not something like nitrogen that we put out and the grass looks greener in a couple days. This takes time to work. At a minimum, we're going to recommend for our Georgia producers to put out 1 ton of lime per acre at least every 2 to 3 years, just to offset the acidity that we see the acidifying effect we see from that nitrogen fertilizer. So even if everything else has stayed the same, just applying nitrogen and cutting for hay or grazing it off is going to start to just acidify that soil slowly over time. So the reason it takes lime so long to work is this wonderful thing called cation exchange capacity in our cations in the soil. I'm not going to give you a chemistry lesson, I promise, but we've got some Legos here to make it a little less painful. So if we have different cations in the soil, and something like aluminum is a very strong cation, hydrogen's weaker, and unfortunately our good nutrients like calcium, magnesium, and potassium, they're even weaker than the aluminum and hydrogen. So if we have a pH of 7, we have our base saturation here. So any point that we could put a nutrient on our Lego soil particle here, we filled with something that's good for the soil and good for the plant. So they're all our potassium, magnesium, calcium, all our sites are filled with these good cations. As we start to move down in our pH, so when we move down to a pH of 6, as hydrogens have started moving in, now only 70 to 80% of our bases are saturated with those cations. Moving down again, once we get into the 5 to 5.5 range, we see more hydrogen start to move in. And once we dip below 5 and we get down into that 4 to 4.5, that's when those aluminums really show up. The reason that it's so easy to go from that pH of 7 to the pH of 5 and below, rather than going the other way, is because of the strength of those cations. It's a lot easier to remove a calcium or a potassium than it is one of those aluminums. And so that's why it takes lime so long to work, is because it's got to move something that really doesn't want to be moved in an environment where it's really thriving in that low pH. The reason we tend to focus more in fertilizer for hay fields is just because of the total cost of the fertilizer in relation to all the expenses for a hay field. So it's about 40% of our inputs into hay production goes straight in, or it comes straight from fertilizer. And so it means we have to be as efficient as we possibly can. So there's a lot of ways that we can minimize nutrient losses. The one that we tend to run in more up in the kind of Piedmont area in the mountains, although I've seen it more frequently here in the South Georgia Tifton area with this rain that will not let up. Runoff is the loss of water, soil nutrients, etc., off the land and into a water source. And I'm not a very artistic person here, so let's just imagine this is on a hillside. We have our soil system here and our grass. We wanted to put out our fertilizer, and then a rainstorm comes. We're getting a lot of those lately. So where's our fertilizer gone? In the case of runoff, it's just went right off a hillside. mountain area, if we're up in the mountains, down here in the coastal plains, when we have a lot of bare ground this time of year in our row crop land, it's just washing off the field and down the road. The best way we can prevent nutrient losses from runoff is to maintain soil cover. If you've never seen one of these rainfall simulators ran, I'd encourage you to look for a video on YouTube or something. It's really cool to see in person. It's set up using a number of different forage type systems, from a well-managed grazing system down to bare ground. The top bottle or row of jars there represent runoff. So you can see that whatever water came down from overhead comes straight out of the flute and into the top jars. And the bottom set represents infiltration. So you can see for our well-managed fields where there's a lot of grass cover out there, there was very little, virtually no runoff, but a lot of infiltration. When we get into our third example there, we called that a poorly managed or overgrazed field. And you can see it's a lot shorter grass than what these other two were. We start to get some runoff, although there's still a fair amount of infiltration there. And of course, when we get to our fourth example, with our bare soil, it's all runoff. There's nothing that's been infiltrated. So this really goes to show the importance of that soil cover for preventing runoff of water and our soil nutrients. So we run into leaching a lot down in our coastal plain type soils. So it's a loss of soluble nitrates or another fertilizer source as it's moving with excess soil water. So we have our same forage system. We put out the fertilizer, and we got that rain that came in. It starts breaking down, usually from an ammonium type source to nitrates. And then we get another rain. So it rained it in like it was supposed to, but then we got another 3 or 4 inches of rain. And that fertilizer is now just moving down through that soil profile. It's usually beyond where the root systems are. So if any of you have put out fertilizer kind of in the coastal plain area where we've been getting a lot of rain in the last couple weeks, and your winter annuals look like you didn't put any fertilizer out at all, this is probably what's happened. So our nutrients vary, and I'll go ahead and put them all up here because I always forget the next order. Our nutrients vary in their mobility. So something like our nitrate nitrogen, we usually don't put out these except for boron on alfalfa. They're very prone to loss. They move very easily. Our ammonium type nitrogens and our potassium, the higher our organic matter, the less mobile they're going to be. So they're going to be fairly mobile down in our coastal plain soils. They shouldn't be as mobile in our soils where it's been a grassland for a while and we're starting to build that organic matter. Things like phosphorus we consider to be relatively immobile unless it's the case of runoff when the soil particles are moving with the water off the field. So volatilization is particularly important when we talk about animal manures and urea sources because it's lost as an ammonia gas. So it's usually if we have a very saturated soil when we put out fertilizer and we get rain again, it's just going to evaporate up into the atmosphere. It happens a lot when we have, we're trying to put out urea in a rainy environment or a very humid area. It's not uncommon if we try to put out urea in kind of the Tifton Alapaha area that if it can be in the fertilizer buggy and it's just dripping out because it's already volatilized and starting to evaporate the gas up into the air and then just the liquid part run out rather than spreading as a solid like we should be able to. So this was some work from up in the Athens area looking at the ammoniavolatilization of our enhanced efficiency or those coated nitrogen products that we talked about earlier. Those can help reduce volatilization through urease inhibition, or it's going to encapsulate and slow release. So you use that a lot in kind of home and garden fertilizers, so something for your home lawn. You'll see the encapsulation. Oops, get it up there. There we go. So if we look, there's a big difference in the 2 years of this study. But if you compare urea to something like that environmentally smart nitrogen or the ESN product, that had the urease inhibitor in there, there's a lot lower level of volatilization. And the last one here is denitrification, although we don't see this a lot because we typically don't have waterlogged soils with a lot of organic matter. But in that case, we're going to lose the nitrogen as a nitrogen gas. So the last thing to touch on here is organic matter. I'm often asked what a good number is for organic matter. If we're in a well-managed, rotationally stocked pastures, we tend to aim for a number of 3.5 to 5%. That's not going to be attainable for our coastal plain soils in majority of the cases. Regardless of where we are in the state, if we're in a poorly managed, continuously stocked pasture system, it's going to be 1 or less in most cases. Less than 1% is not uncommon, especially down in the coastal plains. So all organic matter is the amount of a carbon-based material. So it quantifies what we see as the living component of the soil. As a good rule of thumb, and why we try to really promote organic matter, is every 1% of soil organic matter is going to release 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen, a couple pounds of phosphorus, 10 to 40 pounds of potassium, and a little bit of sulfur every year. The reason I really like organic matter is because it helps buffer against changes in soil pH, and it has a lot of binding sites on there. So we really increase water and nutrient retention in our soil. Unfortunately, most coastal plain soils just aren't capable of building organic matter. So if we are trying to increase that organic matter, really what we need to do is just manage for root health. Tillage is obviously disruptive, so it's going to decrease the organic matter. Good grazing practices, balanced fertility plan, and increasing roots are going to increase that organic matter. And there's data to show that the more roots you have, the more soil carbon that's being sequestered there in the soil. So many of you, like me, are probably fighting a lot of mud right now. Our wet soils can affect plant growth and therefore our fertilizer use. So we need to plan accordingly. Our nutrient concentrations will increase in our winter feeding areas. So move your hay feeding areas and your feed troughs around if you can. And there is some impact of waterlogged soils on nitrogen fixation. So if you do have legumes in your system, be cautious of that. If you'd like some more information, if you can just search UGA soil test handbook, and it pulls up everything you ever wanted to know about soil testing in Georgia. Same thing with our fertilizer recommendations. And then we do have a publication just specific to forages on soil and fertilizer management for our forage systems in our state. So still, like everything else, because of COVID, pretty much almost everything is postponed at this point. We're not planning anything in person. We're just, holding off for a couple weeks to see if we could maybe plan some summer field days. In the meantime, we do still have that new Georgia Forage YouTube channel with a lot of videos on there. There's a request last time for one to be made about using a grazing stick to make grazing recommendations. So we do have one of those videos up there now, so you can help walk through those calculations. We're working through an economic series through January and February. So we got, I think, 2 more weeks of that. So looking at the economic benefit of putting out potassium or drilling versus broadcasting and so on. If you need any other information on forages, and if we do start having digital events, everything's going to be online. It's just georgiaforages.com, and it's really easy to find. And so with that, I can take any questions.
This is Dr. Wilson. How are you? Great presentation. Just some questions about, with the new government coming in. They were talking about carbon credits and things of that nature, especially with livestock and things of that nature. How would one go about, or what forages would you recommend that would help you get those carbon credits? And if you can explain that to the rest of us.
All right. So the question was on carbon credits and where forages fit into that. We have a lot of work to do on the university side of how to calculate that. as a general rule, and there's several papers out there, even for Georgia, putting a land area into perennial pasture or a hayfield, even for that matter, just some sort of perennial forage system helps sequester carbon. It's something in the realm of like 6 times that of row crop production, because we're not disrupting that field and tilling it a couple times a year. If I was to be asked what should be assigned kind of the highest credit, we're going to give kind of preference to our perennial forages like Bahia grass, Bermuda grass, and fescue. But we've got a lot more to learn on that from the university side.
Is there anything positive about burning off a hayfield?
So if it's done correctly, there can be a benefit. It can release some nutrients. We usually see it as a benefit is reducing that thatch layer. So when you get all those little brown stems at the base of your Bermuda grass, usually can start having some disease pressure. So it's good that it removes that. If we are going to burn our field, we want to burn it when it's still fully dormant, but not too far in advance of green up. So for a lot of us in the southern part of the state, that means right now, because it's going to start trying to green up in March or so. So by the end of this month, into the first week of March or so is when we need to be burning. In the kind of middle part of the state, you can, wait probably a few more weeks after that. Your area better than I do. We don't have great recommendations for burning off fescue. That's something we're digging more into, and we'll have a publication on that as soon as we get more information. Okay.
I would say from Tattnall County all the way up to Jefferson County, there is a tremendous amount of recycled lime that comes out of Savannah that's applied not only to crop fields, but also to pastures as well. And one of the things that a lot of producers are not aware of is that, and it's in the fine print, which is a small print, that there is no magnesium in that recycled lime. Over time, Dr. Baxter, could you, I guess, let folks know what could be the potential danger of applying recycled lime and not knowing there's no magnesium in it compared to dolomitic lime, and what the repercussions could be if you're not doing it in your supplement, mineral supplement?
Yeah, so it's rare for us to have a magnesium deficiency, although it can happen. It's not going to be as severe as a nitrogen or potassium deficiency, but it can start to yellow the plant and pull down that yield. Magnesium is incredibly important for legumes, so we're going to see a bigger issue there. We're seeing a lot of these different kind of alternative lime type products show up. In some cases, it's people are paying the producer just so they have somewhere to put the product. And we've got a lot more to learn about the implications from these different products. And the problem is they're just so variable because they're coming from all different parts of the state and being handled in different ways. We haven't figured out yet if there's a good way to test this product that's kind of uniform across the state and our production systems. The other concern is, and I don't know for this particular one, many of the products are applied very heavy, so there's a lot of material being put out, and risk of part of it not breaking down and causing problems in your hay equipment, or even just smothering out the grass in some cases. I'm sure there's a lot of pros to these products, but I think the cons may outweigh the pros in many of these cases, but we just don't know yet.
In Georgia Talk, can you give us a sense of cost? You mentioned the priority for linemen, I guess. The cost per acre for lime versus fertilizer, a complete fertilizer?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on your area. Usually, I don't know if we've ever put it on the dollars per acre just because it varies so much. In general, whereas fertilizer takes up about 40% of your budget in a hayfield, the lime number is usually only 4 to 5%. Yeah. So if we figure, $400 for fertilizer across the season, which may not be unreasonable for many of us in hay production situation. Now we're talking 4-10, not a lot for the per acre cost of that lime. The problem with the lime that we usually run into is you don't get that immediate gratification. So even for me as a researcher, it's really nice. You put out fertilizer, even in my front yard at home, you see that benefit. You can see what you've done, and you've made a positive impact right then on your grazing system or your front yard or whatever. You don't get that same joy with the lime. It's something that protects your system for the long term. But short term, you don't see anything from it.
What I do for my hay field and grazing field, I use a 24, 4, and 12. That's 24 represents the nitrogen, the 4 represent the phosphorus, and the 12 represent the potassium. So my question is, I have a choice of using 2377. Have you studied the yields on either one of those, 24, 4, and 12, or 2377?
So do you have a Bermuda grass hay field?
It is Bermuda, Bahia, clover, fescue. Yeah, that mix.
So if those were my two options I was trying to pick from, I would stick with that 24, 4, 12, unless your soils are just naturally high in potassium, which means you're an anomaly in our state. Nobody's soils in this state that I've encountered is just natural. Nobody's blessed with high potash soils. That 24, 4, 12 better mimics that 4:1:3 ratio that we need for Bermuda grass, especially in our state. If anything, I would add a little potassium to that, but that would be a much more preferable option over that 2377.
Is there any type of cover crop we should be planting for us to help maybe put some nutrients back into the soil for the upcoming spring?
So there's nothing we would be planting now. So if you haven't already planted, just wait till summer. We're just not going to see the cost isn't going to work out for us in most cases, unless we're trying to prevent erosion from happening right now. Going forward, I'm not familiar with if one's necessarily better than the other. We can grow so many different winter forage crops in our state. And then our state is just so variable. It's hard to have a good recommendation. In general, where we see the benefit of that cover crop is, from the soil's perspective, it's keeping our ground covered. So in a case like this spring here, where we're getting a lot of rain very quickly, it's going to better wick that rain and the water into the soil, and not have a situation of runoff or just prolonged mud. So if we're trying to get back into the area with the summer crop, most of the time we're grazing that cover crop. And so even though there may be this fancy mixture that might provide, some good benefits for the soil, I like to call them feel-good mixtures, where you have like 15 things on the bag and you feel like you're doing a lot of good. And when it comes to just cattle productivity on the cover crops, it's hard to top a ryegrass mixture, especially if you just throw a little clover in there.
What I was getting at is basically, if I do a soil sample, just say in September, and I see that my soil profile is missing some type of nutrients, would it be a certain type of cover crop that I can plant during the fall that can help me reduce some of my fertilizer bill the next year? So I don't know if y'all have a chart built like, where say, hey, you're missing a lot of this nutrient. You can plant this type of cover crop during the winter, and it may help the following year when you get ready time to fertilize.
Not that I'm aware of, and it's probably just because of that variability. The only thing that would really come to mind is if you're planting a clover to help fix nitrogen, because you could plant the annual clover in the winter and it release nitrogen to your Bermuda grass or whatever your summer grass is going to be. But our soil tests don't report nitrogen, so that wouldn't be a direct report. It would just be you preparing for the next season.
On a fescue field, fertilizing your fescue field in the fall, September, would you recommend a balanced fertilizer like a triple 13, or would you recommend the nitrogen be a lot higher?
So it would depend on what your fescue needs. It's not going to need near the phosphorus or the potassium that the Bermuda grass does. So that would be based on whatever your soil test recommendation is. In general, we're putting out a lot of nitrogen in that September timeframe because we're trying to stockpile in many cases. And that tends to be why the nitrogen on a lot of recommendations, especially what you see in popular press, outweighs the phosphorus and the potassium.
But in doubt, resort to your soil test.
Yep. I can't give a talk without telling somebody to take a soil test. I can work it into any talk, even a herbicide talk.
Doc, Stefan, again, some folks use Waters Lab, some use UGA's lab. Kind of, I guess, touch a little bit on what you see the differences in the analysis.
The only difference that I'm aware of in the analysis is in the pH. UGA tests the pH in a different way than all the commercial labs do. And so if you're pulling soil samples when the soil is wetter than normal, like now, somewhere like Waters Lab, you can get a kind of artificially high soil pH result from that. Whereas if you use the UGA lab, it would be more accurate. And so as far as I know, that's the only difference between the two.
Any more questions? All righty. Well, thanks again for coming, and we appreciate your time, Dr. Baxter. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.